Hi, I'm Rachel Ward, GP in Oxfordshire, and today I'm really pleased to be joined by Matthew Barber, who is the Deputy Commissioner for Police and Crime in Thames Valley, and also joined by James Senior, who's previously held the position of Detective Inspector for the Regional Organised Crime Unit. We're going to be talking about quite a challenging topic today, and that's exploitation of children and young people, and considering how this happens in involvement with organised crime and drug dealing, such as county lines, which we've touched on a previous conversation. Some pretty gritty topics, but we feel that these are really important issues that people are aware of, because we feel that awareness leads to us spotting problems in our young people and ultimately helping them. Matt, I'm going to start with you. Can you ask me, can you tell me what your experience is and what's going on in Thames Valley Police with these huge issues at the moment?
Yeah, I think the public, when we talk about county lines drugs gangs, and it's come into the lexicon in recent years. I think go back a little while, people wouldn't have known what you're talking about. People get an idea of it now from television, from the media, and from the newspapers. But I think there's probably still a lack of understanding of what it's really about. People see it as simply a drug-related problem, and the commodity is drugs. But the commodity could be anything. This is just a really successful business model. These people are the Amazon of the criminal underworld. They have a great delivery mechanism. They provide great customer service. And that sounds really cynical of me to say it like that, but I think we need to properly understand their business model in order to be able to tackle them. And the real challenge about the method they use is the biggest problem. The commodity they supply causes incredible harm to communities, to individuals who end up taking those drugs, which can destroy their lives. But along the way, there's often an even greater harm caused in the trafficking of these drugs, of the phones, of the money, of the weapons around the country. And all too often, it's children that are exploited in order to carry out that. And they can be exploited financially. They can have physical threats and physical violence. They may be exploited sexually. There may be threats on the family. There's a huge range of ways in which people can be exploited by these gangs, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges for the police in tackling it. That this really becomes a welfare issue of protecting children as much as it does about tackling the drug supply itself.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, up until a few years ago, I didn't know what county lines were, which is actually not something I'm proud of as a GP. And I went on a whole day's training with police and safeguarding, and I was shocked at the stuff that I was finding out about what is happening to these young people who are getting drawn into these gangs and drug dealing, and how they are being exploited on many levels. And I found it shocking and terrifying as a parent. James, you have extensive experience kind of dealing with these situations on the ground. Could you tell us a bit about what your job involves day to day and your experience of how these county lines are operating in our areas?
Yeah, so my job was really centred around supporting the forces in the southeast with tackling county lines, which is not just drug dealing. A lot of people assume that drug dealing is that every drug dealer is a kind of a local individual that can be tackled quite easily. County lines is really, really sophisticated. We're talking about high-end organised criminals with access to firearms and really, really dangerous people. They often, and they do by nature of the crime, exploit force boundaries, which makes it even harder for us to tackle really as the police, because we could have a county line dealer, if you like, based up in Liverpool, for example, and they could be exploiting young people from Liverpool and sending them down to the southeast to deal drugs. So for a force like Thames Valley, we have no idea who the young person is because we've never seen them before, and we don't know where the drug dealer actually is either. So it becomes really, really challenging. So my role was really to try and work with the four forces of the southeast, whilst also working with my counterparts, of which there were coordinators in each region, and work with those to try and tackle county lines, both from where they originate, but also where they ultimately end up and where they're exported into, which would be the southeast, for example. And southeast is a very heavy kind of exporting area. We unfortunately, because of the geography of the southeast, do export from the metropolitan police area, as well as other cities such as Manchester and Liverpool. So it's really, really challenging area. But I basically work with my counterparts across the country to try and overcome those issues around force boundaries.
I mean, and as you've summed that up brilliantly, that as Matt says, this is a very successful business model, because they have seen the issue, the things out there, if they have people moving across boundaries, you don't know young children, it makes it far difficult to intercept, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
And you touched on something there. You said, often we're dealing with young people that we don't know. One thing that I've been made aware of with county lines is that often the children that are targeted are not necessarily the ones you would expect. So often they are ones that have never been in touch with the police, attending school, because they are more difficult to trace. They're more difficult to find. Could you tell us a little bit about the kind of kids, the kind of young people that are vulnerable and are targeted by these drug dealers and gangs?
Yeah, so I would say that every child is vulnerable to being exploited by county lines. There seems to be this perception that county lines gangs will only target really vulnerable children that have grown up in the care system, that are from broken families, for example. Simply is not the case, and we've seen some quite professional people whose children have ultimately been exploited by county lines gangs, and actually they could live in amazing £1 million houses somewhere in the suburbs, but yet they are still at risk from being exploited. So there isn't one specific type of child that will be groomed and targeted. It literally is absolutely everyone, and we are doing quite a lot of work around how county lines gangs are recruiting vulnerable people and children. And we seem to see that a lot of it happens at schools. We also see that a lot of children are exploited online. So again, that makes it really challenging for us as the police to really combat that, because there just simply isn't a specific type of victim that's always targeted. It could literally be any child. And we've had all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds.
And that is a really important thing for people to take on board, because, as you say, I think sometimes with these things we think of drugs and a dark side of the world, and we think that's never going to affect me, but actually it can affect anybody. And I think that is a really, really important message. Could you tell us, not necessarily a specific case study of a real case, but could you give us an example of kind of how it would start out with a young person maybe being approached, and how it goes through the process of getting into involved with the gang and starting to be exploited, just to kind of give people a picture of how it happens?
Yeah. I mean, so one example actually was a child whose father was in the emergency services. So I was actually delivering some training, and that father came up to me afterwards and said, "I've just realised that my child has been exploited by county lines." And it was really quite powerful. But what ultimately happened with them was that their child was simply buying some food from a takeaway shop after school, as a lot of children do. And they were approached by an individual who was in their late teens. And that individual basically bought their food for them and said, "Oh, don't worry about it. I've got this. That's fine." And the child naturally was a little bit surprised, but that was it. And then there was another encounter, and that individual then said, "Well, yesterday I bought you your dinner, so now you need to do something for me. You don't just get free food." So that child was clearly very intimidated. And before you know it, he was asked to take a package from one place to another. And then it evolved from there. And before you know it, he's now no longer attending school, and he's wrapped up in that environment that is now really, really difficult to escape from. And that's as simple as it is. I mean, that child was not from a disadvantaged background whatsoever. And it was simply just someone buying food for them at a takeaway shop. and it's just evolved from there. And it's really sad to hear.
I think that the sophistication of the recruitment process is really quite incredible. And through the PCC's office, we funded a drama presentation that's gone into schools across the Thames Valley, and hopefully by now the majority of children in Thames Valley would have had the opportunity to see this. And it's gone out to parents as well. And I've watched it with parents, and it's hugely impactful. Exactly the sort of example that James gives of the opportunities that these recruiters will find, whether it is just buying that meal, offering someone that gift. In the particular drama presentation, there was a boyfriend who wanted to buy a gift for his girlfriend, who was disappointed that she didn't have whatever, and this chap just offered to lend him some money to buy a gift for his girlfriend. And it feels like they're being friendly towards you. What could be nicer than that? And the escalation is then incredibly quick. And as we've discussed before, we always give the message to young people to talk to your parents, to talk to your teachers, to talk to a police officer. But actually, put yourself in their shoes. It can be incredibly difficult when you've made that one seemingly very innocent mistake. It would have been nothing to go back and for that lad to tell his father that someone bought him some food in a takeaway. That's not a problem. A week later, he's in so deep he feels he can't talk to anyone. And it's incredibly quick and as I say, very, very impressive and really, really difficult to tackle. But there will be these elements of the gangs who will specialise in that recruitment, and they are incredibly good at judging people and approaching people and appearing as if they are your friends.
Yeah, and I think we need to be having those conversations with our children. We need to be, it's a sad situation to be saying, if somebody comes and tries to do you a favour, be suspicious. That is unfortunate, but I think we have to be having those conversations. Children need to be aware of those dangers and what the implications could be. We need to be honest with our children and discuss it. Matt, we were chatting earlier. You said about some of the things that happen where they will set up, they will get a child to take something and then set up somebody coming to steal it, to put them into debt. Could you explain that situation? Because that's quite a common scenario.
Yeah, so it may have been exactly the sort of case that James was alluding to. And this is a reasonably well-known tactic now, where someone will be asked to transport a package. It could just be a couple of streets away. And again, it seems reasonably innocent for someone you think is your friend or you're building up a relationship with. Can you do me a favour and just take this to an address? And they probably won't know what's in the package. It could be drugs, it could be money, it could actually be nothing. And a couple of streets away, they will be robbed by someone, and they'll come back to the person who's given the package and they'll say, "Look, I'm really sorry. I've just been robbed," and they'll be traumatised by the robbery, frankly. Now, the person who stole whatever that package was from them was from the same gang. But now so they've recovered whatever was in the package, if anything. But now the person who's recruited them will say, well, there was £500 worth of drugs in there, or cash, or whatever the commodity allegedly was. You now owe me for that. But don't worry, you can work off that debt. If you deliver a few more packages for me, then you won't. And they get in again deeper and deeper into this cycle. And it's one of those stages, you can imagine if you slip down that road, it does make it incredibly difficult for people to get out of it. And it's why one of the key messages, I think, around County Lines is that the police understand that nuance, and more so now than ever, the police will treat those young people as victims of crime and not as perpetrators. And I think if you are a mother, a father, a family member, a teacher, a doctor who's got some suspicions, there is naturally, I think, a reluctance to report that to the police if you feel there will be consequences for that young person. And I think we need to reassure everybody that as far as possible, the police understand that and will seek to protect and safeguard that young person in the whole affair. So it's much better for everybody to try and get those issues out into the open to get the help that they need, because they can be protected from the gangs.
Yeah. And I think, it's a very difficult topic to discuss, but I think we have to mention it, that things can get so extreme that people, these young children will be threatened that if they don't continue to toe the line, they don't continue to do stuff, members of their family will be killed, or, it can get very, very nasty, can't it? And to the extent that I know it's really difficult for you guys getting involved when you're at the stage having to kind of try and protect whole families and move them. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the level of violence and threats offered to not just the young person that's being exploited, but also their wider family, can be really, really significant and really quite frightening. When you look at the serious case review of Jayden Moody, who was the young child murdered in London, who had found himself sent to various parts of the country, an element of the tactic that County Line used was that they would also target his mum, and they actually threatened his mum at their home address. Yeah. So that goes to show the lengths that a County Line will take in order to continue that exploitation of a young person who is actually quite valuable to their business model.
Yeah. And can we now have a think about things that people should be looking out for, some of the telltale signs? So one that I'm particularly aware of is that these young people, these children, will suddenly have multiple mobile phones coming from nowhere, and that is the county line, the county, the phone line where people are phoning to tell them about who's ordering drugs, where to get drugs, and people ordering a delivery, that kind of thing. And so suddenly they will have multiple mobile phones that are swapping frequently. You don't know where they've come from. They may be going into other rooms to take calls frequently. That's something you may pick up on. James, what would you say are things that people need to look out for in their children or their pupils or their grandchildren?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be building on that. It'd be mobile phones, but also large amounts of cash. It could be new clothes, and new trainers or footwear, new gadgets, to ultimately ask the question, where on earth are they getting that money from in order to afford those gifts? Because they have to be getting the gifts from somewhere. And it's a simple grooming tactic that if you provide a young person with gifts and gadgets and clothes that young people like, then that young person suddenly feels part of some kind of family. And they will then continue to be exploited and groomed without them even realizing it. In addition, another sign could be evidence of drugs use or drugs dealing. So it could be kind of small deal packages that might be empty, left over in their rooms. It could be long trips away, whereby a young person may suggest that they're staying around at a friend's house, and actually they're the other side of the country without the parent even realizing. So it could be evidence of travel. So it could be a train ticket or a bus ticket, because we are seeing young people get on the train system, but also coaches. So I think as a parent, it's really important to look out for evidence of long distance travel, evidence of them being involved in drug supply. So it could be suddenly carrying a weapon, because County Line's gangs are really dangerous places to be. And a young person may feel as if they need to protect themselves. So they may want to carry a knife. So a parent really does need to look out for these telltale signs. But I think a key one that's often missed is the communication with the school, because the school and teachers will often notice the change in behaviour really quickly, because they'll suddenly see that they're hanging around with different people at school. They'll suddenly see that what was once a really bubbly, bright young person is suddenly starting to change at school. And they're kind of really key areas that can often be overlooked, because the teachers will see some really significant changes in behaviour, and they're the types of kind of warning signs really that young person could, I mean, not necessarily is, but could be being exploited.
Yeah. And I think I'd like to at this point touch on sexual exploitation. Again, not a nice topic to discuss, but sadly something I think, as parents and, knowing young people, looking out for young people, and as a GP and as a professional, it's something we need to be fully aware of. And in this situation, it may be that children start to be exploited sexually, and it may be along with the threats. It may be along with, the kind of being bought into the fact that they are one of the dealer's girlfriends or boyfriends and in a special position. And again, it's something you need to be aware of. So it may be that your son or daughter suddenly has physical symptoms that, they maybe want to go to a sexual health clinic or speak to the GP. Suddenly they want to go to the GP to ask about contraception, but you're not aware of a partner or somebody they've, been seeing regularly. Just if things are not adding up. And I think, gut instinct is a very, very important thing as a parent. And I think if something's not adding up, if you're thinking, why do I not know the full picture? You need to question it. And if you're not getting anywhere, then by all means, talk to somebody else, talk to teachers, talk to your GP, say, I'm worried about my son or daughter, something's not adding up, and we will be more than happy to listen.
And I think that the sexual exploitation angle, there's probably two parts to it. That children will be exploited for the sexual gratification of the sexual act, but also in this particular sort of business model, as I was describing it, it's often a part of the entrapment into it. We know we have a whole separate issue around sexting and children sharing explicit images of themselves, and often it's relatively, I use the word innocent, which sounds very inappropriate, but it will be between children of a similar age, simply growing up in a modern age. It's not to condone it, but it's relatively contained. But often children will be tricked into sharing images with perhaps someone they do think is of their own age, or sharing those images further. And again, once they've done that, then the gang has as a point of blackmail for them, to threaten them with the exposure to their friends, to their family, to the wider public. So I think there's a real challenge there, that it's not just sexual exploitation for sexual gratification, it's as a tool. And I think, again, we still probably presume that will be girls, and it's not. Especially when it comes to exploitation, there are plenty of opportunities for the gangs to exploit young boys as well. So I think we just need to be aware of those dangers, you say.
Absolutely. Can we bring this round now to what people should do if they suspect something of somebody they know, or even, seeing a child, or a young person, you think something not right here. I didn't like the way that person was treated. If somebody has suspicions, what should they do next?
So I think the first one is to have some honest discussions with that young person. I think while potentially some concerns around exploitation, it doesn't necessarily mean they are being exploited, and actually having a discussion with a young person may alleviate some of those concerns, and it could lead to something else and not necessarily be county lines or sexual exploitation. So have that discussion. If there are some concerns from that point, there are some really good charities out there. There's some really good support services that can provide some advice specifically for parents. And in addition, ultimately, the police. We have some really good safeguarding teams here in Thames Valley that can offer that support to parents. They can engage with young people both in front of their parents and away from parents to try and get to the bottom of what's really going on. And we have some really good schemes across different areas in Thames Valley that can support that young person to ultimately help them see that they don't have to lead a life of exploitation. We can help them escape those exploiters. And ultimately, whilst county lines have historically exploited force boundaries, and used the fact that forces necessarily didn't always speak to each other enough, that has dramatically improved, both within the coordinator role within the regions, the regional organised crime units, but you only have to look now at the Metropolitan Police. There's some brilliant stuff that they're doing that are ultimately impacting the county lines that are going out into the southeast. So the forces that are exporting are now taking responsibility for the gangs that are moving children and sending children into other areas. And it's now not as easy as it was to establish yourself as a county line. The message would be to have an honest discussion with that young person. And if there are any concerns, there's certainly some professional agencies and the police that are there to support.
Great. And I will just add that from a GP's perspective, of course, we also, we are here if you have problems with your children and you're thinking there's something going on here. If you feel you just need to talk it through, if something's not adding up, we are also somebody that you can pick up the phone, have a conversation. Often in this situation, just running it by somebody else, putting it out there it's very helpful and very reassuring. And so GP is always a route into assistance as well. Matt, can you just tell me, to kind of close things up, where do you think things are going with this? I mean, there's obviously a huge amount of progress that's being made, but it's a massive problem. How do you see things developing with county lines, and do you think we're making headway with it?
I think we are, and actually the National Crime Agency runs some national weeks, intensification weeks they're called, where all forces have a concerted effort around county lines. Thames Valley actually normally comes top of that list with the number of arrests, with the amount of cash seized, the amount of mobile phones seized. I think there are around 91 arrests in the last big week of action that we had, and some of the impact, certainly this time round, has really seriously damaged some of those gangs for the long term. And it's not just picking up people low down in the organisation. There's some really good work to actually try and dismantle some of the organised crime gangs. I mean, sadly, this is going to be an ongoing battle. Although the county lines model we talk about as being relatively new, all we're seeing is criminal exporting a commodity around the country and exploiting new technology to do it. And although we talk about it now and it's been given a name, sadly, it's nothing new. There have always been criminal gangs exploiting new technology, whatever that might be at the time, and exploiting the most party, whether that's the youngest or most vulnerable in other ways because of their exclusion from mainstream society. So sadly, I fear it's something we are never going to solve, but I do feel we are making some really big inroads. The Thames Valley Violence Reduction Unit that the PCC manages, I think is doing a lot within Thames Valley to try and coordinate the effort. So all that support that James talked about, trying to make sure that all of those agencies are singing from the same hymn sheet, that we all have the same referral mechanisms, that we all know the help that we need to give to children, and we make sure the whole picture is joined up between GPs and schools and social services and the police. And that's not a small task to join up those agencies that don't often talk, but we are getting there. And as James has said, the communication across the country between police forces, with the National Crime Agency, I think the regional organised crime units are doing a fantastic job actually in managing some of those jobs that might otherwise be too big for some forces, because we need to recognise this is a nationwide challenge. Frankly, it's an international challenge in the overall supply of drugs, but we are getting there with putting the systems in place to try and deal with it, and that's all very well as a politician talking about the systems, but the thing that encourages me most is we are seeing the impacts on the ground, and we are seeing those arrests being made. We are seeing disruptions to the gangs, and we are seeing a significant number of young people being safeguarded as a result of the work of the police.
And I think as a final point, what I would say is, as professionals and as organisations, I think there's a lot going on in the background. But I think overall, we as adults in our community owe it to our young people to have an awareness of this, first of all. So, just by listening to this information, you're making a contribution, and also just having the confidence to speak out and recognise it and ask for help if you suspect something like this is going on, because as we've said, this is a very, very unpleasant scenario for your children to be involved in, and we want people to know about it.
And I think there's one, just to add another thought to this, is one area where, as you say, as adults in our society, we all have a responsibility. There are still, sadly, a lot of people out there who see recreational drug use as acceptable. Often powdered cocaine, amongst those professional classes that James talked about, who may still have their children exploited, see this as a harm-free recreation. And I think we need to get over the message that you may be sitting in your living room having a dinner party, to use the stereotype, sharing some Class A drugs, but there's a reasonable chance that several children, not somewhere the other side of the world, but several children in your town, in your county, have been exploited in order to get those drugs to you. And I think we need to understand that there is a whole set of responsibility there, not just, as you quite rightly say, Rachel, as parents, as adults, looking out for children, but that section of society that feels that their recreational activity does no harm. We need to recognise it really does, and it's destroying children's lives.
I think that is a very good, sobering thought, but very important. Thank you both for chatting today about it. As we've said several times, this is a difficult subject, but we believe it's really important to discuss it. So thank you very much for joining me to have this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.